Hello, good morning. Welcome to the first session of the Oregon Wine Industry Symposium's Viticulture track. This morning, we're going to start out with a session on grapevine growth and physiology throughout the summer months. What's the grapevine doing from bud break through fruit set? This will set the stage for our second talk today on leaf removal and its effects. Our first speaker is Brian Behringer, and he's the faculty and program chair for the viticulture program at Chemeketa Community College. He teaches the viticulture courses and is part of the team that is teaching the students enrolled in the IE VOI program. Brian has a Master's of Science in Viticulture and Enology from a joint program between Montpellier SUPAgro, Bordeaux Sciences Agro, and the Geisenheim University in Germany. He has worked in vineyards and wineries in the Languedoc region of southern France and in the Moselle Valley region of Germany. His main area of interest lies in organic and biodynamic wine production. Brian also has a Master's of Science in Agricultural Systems from North Carolina State University and spent more than 18 years working with farmers and managing agricultural development projects in Africa, Asia, and Latin America before moving into the wine industry. I look forward to hearing what Brian has to say and seeing lots of your questions as they come through in the Q&A. Just click on the chat button, ask your questions, and Brian will be answering them live as we go through his session. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to plant biology, the summer basics. This is going to be a short lecture, not taking into account the whole summer growing season, as that is quite a complex interaction between environment, phenology, and physiology, the various hormones and inner workings of the vine. So we're going to cover here mostly from bud break up until fruit set, and then I believe that the next presentation is going to talk a bit about leaf pulling and the effect of fruit set and maturation of the berries. Right? But for us, typically, we look at here the 5 stages of grapevine phenology: bud break, bloom, veraison, harvest, which is basically berries are ripe. It's kind of a man-made phenology stage, as we are actually cutting the grapes off the plant. But if we did not cut the grapes off the plant, of course, they would turn into raisins themselves, and that stage would be finished and then into dormancy here. So in terms of viticulture and vineyard management, our stage really starts here at dormancy, right? That's when our season begins. But the growing season really starts here at bud break. So typically what we'll see is something like this if we were to put it just into sequence. Dormancy, where we're doing our pruning, setting our number of buds per plant or per linear foot. Then moving into bud break, the plant is starting to grow. Bloom, of course, flowering, that's going into fruit set. We're producing the fruit, which is, of course, what we want in viticulture. And then that fruit is ripening, and then we're harvesting, right? That's what the 5 stages broken down very, very simply. But we're going to look at it slightly differently. We're going to look at it more in terms of after dormancy, we do have bud break, but we go into a stage of rapid shoot growth, where the plant is growing very, very rapidly. And then we will go into bloom, right? So the plant is basically preparing to fertilize itself, and then we get fruit set and fruit growth, then into veraison, maturity, and into harvest. And in parallel, we're going to look what's happening in the plant as well in terms of physiology, right? So we have dormancy, we have canopy development happening here in the together with rapid shoot growth. We then have some stress as the plant is basically slowing down, putting energy into flowering. At the same time, we also end up here as well with higher temperatures and less rainfall or drier conditions. We then go after fruit set into veraison, which is just before or during veraison, we get sugar loading as well, which is the plant putting sugar into the plant. And then, of course, afterwards we get peak color accumulation, especially for red wines. So for us, we're going to really focus here on these 2 stages. We're not going to talk about those 5 stages: dormancy, bud break, bloom, veraison, and harvest. We are going to talk about more bud break, rapid shoot growth, bloom, stress, sugar loading, color accumulation. But for our purpose of the presentation, we're going to focus basically on this section, and further presenters will take it from there. All right, so just to take a look overall, these 5 stages, When do they happen? Just a refresher for all of us. Here, this is in the Willamette Valley. Of course, in other places might be different, but for us, here, bud break typically happening around 13th of April. We usually have 60 to 70 days until the next event. Bloom happening around mid-June. Again, another 60 to 70 days until the next event. Raison coming around third week of August. Again, typically 30 to 45 days until the next event. And then harvest coming around, say middle to third week of September. That really is going to depend on the wine style and what our goals are in terms of overall, say, harvest grape characteristics, right? So some people may pick earlier for sparkling, or you will pick later if you have a later ripening variety, such as Gamay or Riesling, right? And then here in dormancy, that usually picks up here around the end of October. So more or less the growing season is going to be 150 to 190 days long. Such a big range in there. That's basically because not all varieties are the same. Some require more heat units to ripen and to go through flowering or even bud break. So we do get basically plants that do need 150 days, others need 190 days. Right, so heat units, what are heat units? Again, another review, right? This is basically looking at how fast do plants grow and what requires them to grow. And basically, grapevines, they do not grow when the temperature is below 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the air, right? So basically every unit or amount of heat we have over 50 degrees, we determine as a heat unit, right? For bud break, it's slightly different where we need 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the air, but also we need it to be above 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the soil. That's going to stimulate the roots to send some signals up to the buds and to tell them to start swelling and burst, right? But temperature is not enough. Also for bud break, we need at least 13 hours of sunlight per day for that to happen. So basically for us, that's why we would start counting our growing degree days or heat units from April 1st until October 30th, as that's when we're going to have that temperature and that sunlight able to stimulate plant growth. Right. Of course, that's not the whole story as well. That's a very, very simplified answer, but we do have other as well means to measure growing degree days, growing heat units. You saw on the past slide, there was the Hublin index, which also takes into account latitudes. There is a coefficient there that we use to adjust for day length as our summer days are longer here, the farther north we go in the summer. As well, what came actually about 20 years ago, but is still being researched more and more here, is this biologically effective degree days, which basically is putting a cap, right? So when it gets really hot, 90, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the plant doesn't really grow faster. There's a cap, there's a limit. And basically what has been found is that once we get above an average of 66 degrees, the plants don't really grow faster. It's going to be more characteristic of how many hours per day we have, and that's going to determine how many hours of photosynthesis we can do, and also how long is our growing season, how many days do we have where it's over 66 degrees Fahrenheit, right? So if it's 75 degrees on average or 85 degrees on average, the plant's not really going to grow faster. All right, so basically, where are we here in the Willamette Valley? We'll focus here. We're here in this region, cool climate, where we're looking at Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc, or Riesling. That's really going to be able to ripen well. If we're thinking about eastern Oregon, we're going to be here in this region too, where we're going to be able to do more Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Semillon, Syrah, Chardonnay, or even in some places where it's even warmer, we'll even get some Tempranillo or Grenache that we can ripen here as well. But these are all based on the number of heat units that we're accumulating throughout the year, right? And these units are basically being added upon each other. So every day we are adding on the total heat accumulation from the past days, starting from April 1st. Okay. So we talked that not all plants are the same. So we can see here, this is some research that's been done looking at growing degree days and phenology. And you can see that we have different varieties are hitting different stages of phenology at different growing degree days, right? So in terms of, say, bud burst, Chardonnay here requires the least number of growing degree days, which is usually why it's the first one to have bud break as well. Or look at Pinot Noir here is coming in at 47, so it's coming in later than Chardonnay. But as well, Pinot Noir here will have less growing degree days than Chardonnay in terms of bloom, so it will actually bloom slightly sooner. So every plant is different, and this is basically what this slide is showing here. But if we take an average of most of these varieties, we can say that on average we'll hit bud break around 49 degrees, 49 heat units. We'll hit flowering around 457 and veraison around 1,279. We don't put harvest in our heat units, as harvest is really going to be dependent on the human aspect, and that is basically based on the characteristics and the wine style that we want to make. Right? So this is a pretty accurate method we can use to try to predict when we're going to have these various stages throughout the growing season by monitoring our weather and our temperature and our sunlight. But it's not exact, right? So we basically, we can predict within a week, more or less. And we do also have some differences as well in terms of variety and their requirements to grow. So while we do say 50 degrees is the requirement for plants to grow, we have to have more than 50 degrees for growth to resume. Actually, some plants can grow even, start growing even as low as 43 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so moving on here, this is basically where we are here in terms of here, Willamette Valley in Oregon. We fall between this cool and intermediate ranges where we are able to grow these varieties here quite successfully. Recently, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. We are also getting more of we can say, a more higher acid wine style than those over here, as in the more intermediate to warm style. But what is now will not always be. You can see here that with the predicted climate change, may actually shift our we can say our indexes or where we fall in categories of what can be grown. And with this, what will also happen is that while we would be able to ripen other varieties that require longer heat units, our phenology may also change as it's getting warmer. So we're accumulating more growing degree days, and that's going to, of course, affect our flowering and veraison and bud break times. Right? So if we just take a look, this is from the 2020 vintage report put out by Linfield University. We can actually see here that our bud break over the past 3 years is getting slightly earlier. As well here, if we look at flowering, we are actually getting slightly earlier if we compare to earlier vintages as well. And veraison also getting slightly earlier as well. So basically, as we're increasing our heat units, or we're having more days that are over that 66 degrees growing required temperature, we are basically shortening our cycles here as well. So I'll move on here. So basically, this is just taking a look at the average growing degree days and also looking at our progression of the grapevine. And you can see here, 49 degrees dormancy, 457 growing degree days. So up until that time, we will have very rapid shoot growth, and then we will have up to 1,279, we will have veraison. All right, so let's continue to move. We'll continue here with bud break. So with bud break, basically still temperatures start to rise in the winter, and basically continue until early spring. This usually happens, just after mid-February when we start to kind of slowly creep into spring. Sap flow begins when soil temperatures reach about 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and that kind of also signals the plant, that to get ready to rehydrate as well. And then bud breaks then starts when temperatures are above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, right? But air temperature is not always what we can measure or what we need to measure, right? We have to remember that our buds are outside, they're receiving direct sunlight, and basically our buds can be up to 4 degrees Fahrenheit higher than our ambient temperatures around, just because they're absorbing that radiation and they are becoming slightly hotter, slightly warmer, right? Very important to know that buds, they are hardy before they break, but just at bud break or even coming up to the woolly bud stage, temperatures at less than 30 degrees can cause bud death. And once we actually have bud break and rapid shoot growth, a frost is really going to be quite detrimental for us, and that's when we go below 32 degrees. And this is usually happening here about mid-April in the Willamette Valley. Of course, not everywhere is the same, right? We have to also try to take into account temperature, and of course, where your weather station is very important. So, of course, as we are increasing in elevation, we're actually losing temperature. Every 100 feet, will be about 1/3 degree Fahrenheit cooler. So that's also going to affect in terms of bud break time, ripening times, or times of these phenological stages as well. We're going to be slightly delayed at higher elevations. Right? And we can see here, even within 1.8 miles here of each other in the Chehalem Mountains, we basically lose quite a bit of growing degree days, over 272 growing degree days, basically with this elevation change of around 550 feet. So it can be quite significant. Slope is also very important in terms of how long we're retaining heat, both in the spring and the summer and in the fall. So you can see if we are planted on a southern slope here, we basically are increasing our radiation and also hence increasing our temperature in the spring. In the summer, we become more or less on par with a flat planted area, flat planted vineyard. But coming up here into the fall, into August, September, October, the steeper the slope, the more direct radiation we're receiving, the more that we're tilted towards the equator, and the longer and it's staying warmer at these sites, which also, even though sometimes they're higher, we do end up with a longer growing season there as well. And also warmer temperatures and at times delayed leaf fall or delayed dormancy compared to places that are down here on the flat area. All right, soil water holding capacity really also influences timing of bud break. That's also because we were talking that we need to have at least 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the soil, and soils that hold more water are going to be cooler because basically water is as well as absorbing heat and taking it longer to warm. So if we look at these three basic soil types that we have here in the Willamette Valley, this kind of lowest, very sandy clay is going to hold less water, especially towards the upper, the A horizon and part of the B horizon, and that's also going to cause it to have bud break faster on sites with this kind of soil. All right, so climate and soil, our site is not only the only factor in terms of bud break timing, right, but of course our rootstock, right? So if we have a long vegetative cycle, we're going to bud break later than if we have a short vegetative cycle. So if we take a look at basically the American rootstock parents, Belandieri, Rupestris, Vinifera, and Riparia, these guys here are going to ripen much. To have bud break much later, and here in Oregon, basically as well. RG will be the first one to have bud break, followed by unrooted, followed by 1114, and followed by 3309. The same goes with varieties. As we saw before, not all varieties have the same required heat units for bud break as well. So different varieties are going to experience different bud breaks at different times. For example, here we're going to have Chardonnay is going to bud break before Pinot Noir, and of course Pinot Noir is going to have bud break before Riesling. Riesling, one of the later bud break varieties as well. So basically, we can always use Chardonnay or even Gewürztraminer if you have it to be kind of an indicator of when bud break will happen. So if we have Chardonnay on Riparia Gouar or RG rootstock, it's a pretty good indicator that when we have bud break there, we're going to have bud break in the rest of our vineyard pretty soon. All right, so what is bud break? What constitutes bud break as well? It's basically when you first start to see the first leaf tips visible, right? So not necessarily separated from the shoot, right? So just here you can see you can probably stick your fingernail between the new leaf tips, but barely. And here you can see that here that leaf is basically separated from the tip, right? So basically at bud break, the plant starts to rehydrate. The water content rises from 40 to 80 degrees at the bud swell stage. And that is another reason why it is susceptible to frost. Right? Carbohydrates are delivered to the buds from the root reserves, but also as well, a lot of carbohydrate is coming here at the beginning from our first row cane, or what we bent down this year, or from your cordon arm. Right? This is also triggered by the decline of production of acetic acid, or also known as ABA. That's also kind of when hormone that's repressing the buds, and with warmer temperatures, the roots basically start decline production of this, and bud break begins. Right. So basically, as well, what we have is what's called in France is acrotony, but also called here is correlative inhibition, and that is basically looking at along a dormant cane, you're going to have bud break coming from your distal end first, right? So we think back to a grapevine. What is a grapevine? It is basically a forest plant that is growing up trees for support, climbing up the tree to the top of the canopy, and then basically spreading out. So it basically wants to get a jump start every year, and will send out the shoots from these top buds first, right? Just to gain advantage, or height advantage, we can say, right? So basically, to try to avoid this, we bend our canes down, right? So by bending our cane down, we still have this uneven bud break along a cane, but it's not going to be as exaggerated as if we were to leave our canes up. The same with spur pruning as well. By cutting it down to 2 or 3 buds per spur, we are basically really cutting off that effect itself. So instead of the first 2 or 3 buds breaking up here, they are actually the only buds on the spur. Right? We can use this to our behavior, to our advantage, especially in frost-prone regions. We can leave our canes upright, and we can bend them down once our frost window has passed as well. Or as well, we can leave them up, especially in cane pruned ones, so not doing pre-pruning, but leaving them up and then coming back after the frost window has passed and cutting it down to 2 buds. So you'll see up here we will have bud break, but these buds down here are still dormant and oppressed and still relatively safe from frost. All right. So after bud break, we go here into rapid shoot growth, right? So that occurs and is very, very rapid growth. We're talking about new leaves appearing every 3 to 5 days, basically depending on how warm it is in the spring. Some varieties, the buds are pink or reddish. That is actually due to accumulation of anthocyanins, the same things that make grape or wine a red color. It is very, very sensitive to frost during these first 3 to 4 weeks of growth. And basically as well, we also can get these dense leaf hairs as well that are coming up here. You can see it makes the leaves almost seem white. And this, what it's doing is the new tissue is very, very sensitive, and it's getting a lot of radiation from the sun. And this, the anthocyanins in the leaf hairs are basically kind of protecting the young tissue from not receiving too much radiation and burning. Here we can look, this is another picture of a young shoot. Here we have about the 2-leaf stage. We can see the inflorescences of the flowers also appearing at this time. And then we have some here, the unopened leaf, and here it's our shoot tip as well forming. And we see here we have these very, very dense leaves, dense hairs on our leaves, and also this reddish color here. As well as internodes are being formed, and also here the buds being formed, right, are prompt and compound bud being formed. Also the compound bud, which of course will be our shoot next year. So what are the dangers besides frost at this time? Rust mites, quite common here in the Willamette Valley, where we have cooler springs, and the plant cannot really grow faster to outpace the damage done by the mites. And we get this kind of stunting, deformed shoots here caused by mites, especially by rust mites. This can be a big problem as well if the inflorescence is damaged, right? We're talking about these small guys here that are very, very sensitive. If they are damaged by mites, we will have some reduction in yield as well. And then the other side is powdery mildew, where all green tissue is susceptible. We get something that looks similar to rust mite damage, but not really so much deformed leaves, more cupped leaves. And of course, all the white powdery mildew showing up here, that's going to look slightly different than the leaf hairs, right? Here, just do our temperatures in Northern Oregon. Usually we have it basically above between 50 and 80 degrees, and enough water that we get our primary infection breaking around 6 inches of growth. Of course, if it's warmer, it can be earlier as well. Afterwards, between 50 and 92 degrees Fahrenheit, we get spread of powdery mildew. So if we take a look here at our phenological stages and look at what are our risks, basically here, at bud break and beginning of rapid shoot growth, we have frost risk. We have risk also for mites, and powdery mildew is starting around this time and continuing all the way up to veraison. All right, so we're going to continue just talking a little bit more about rapid shoot growth and basically what's happening as the plant is growing at this time, right? So this time, the growth of both shoots and roots is entirely from energy reserves stored in the woody material and also in the roots, right? Well, the roots are woody material, so we can say canes, cordons, trunks, and roots, right? And this basically will continue. They will continue to be a net energy user until they are basically big enough to be able to create enough energy to support themselves, right? So basically, in the initial spring growth phase, up to the 5-6 leaf stage, the plant's actually consuming so much carbohydrates, but it actually loses dry weight, right? It doesn't really lose weight because a lot of it is water coming in, but coming up through the roots. But in terms of actual dry weight, the plant is actually getting thinner as it's using its reserves, right? The stored reserves in the grapevine reach its lowest around bloom time or sometimes slightly later, and that also makes our vines vulnerable to nutrient stress around bloom, which is, of course, the most important time for us as well, because if we have good bloom and good fruit set, that, of course, gives us, hopefully, a good crop in the fall, right? So typically this time, one reason why we're taking the first tissue analysis of the season, checking the status of the plant, and is it being stressed as it's reaching its minimum reserves at this time. Oh, sorry. In terms of carbohydrate accumulation or depletion, we can see here that as we are moving from bud break down to flowering, we have a really rapid decline of carbohydrates in the plant. And after flowering, it does start to pick up slowly, and then up to veraison, it really starts to pick up when we start to build a lot of reserves back. Of course, here in the bunches, and this drop here is our harvest, but also here in the roots, in the wood and our shoots as well, we're starting to accumulate more dry mass and more carbohydrates. We're recovering at this point. Just taking a look here as well in terms of rate of growth, you can see up here at the beginning, just after bud break, our rate of shoot growth up to about 30 days. It's really, really fast and then starts to slowly decline afterwards. Here as well as the roots lagging slightly behind the shoots. The peak root growth in the spring here is happening around 40 days after bud break, just as the shoot growth is starting to slow down, right? It's not declining. We still have very, very rapid shoot growth, but it is just starting to slow down. And the roots, again, will pick up here, growth after harvest, when it is free of that burden of grapes. And well, here as well, we have the berries. We have our first growth here in stage 1. Then we have our lag phase here, where growth is basically slowing down. And then we have, as well, past veraison and sugar loading, the growth of our berries as well. Right, so what's the driving factor and how fast our shoots will grow? Air temperature is by far the driving factor. However, the more water we have available, that will allow for increased growth and as well as translocation of carbohydrates, right? So if it's dry, we don't have water basically to transport our carbohydrates and nutrients from our storage up into our shoots and into our leaf tips, right? So that's very, very important to have enough water. In Eastern Oregon, we will, of course, need to be on our irrigation if it's dry to make sure that we are supplying enough water for this good transportation of carbohydrates throughout the plant. And of course, water is also a key component for photosynthesis and cell respiration, and so equally important, right? As well, nitrogen reserves and how much carbohydrates are stored in our plants and our roots will also speed up our growth. So the more reserves we have, the faster it will grow as well. Rootstock is also important. So more vigorous rootstock will also influence higher rates of growth on the scion and hence on the shoot growth. So for example, SO4 is going to go much faster than 10114. 2309 is going to go much faster than Riparian de Gaulois. And of course, this is not uniform throughout the vineyard. As well, this is our NDVI map from Chemeketa, where we can see that we have high vigor spots here where we have pockets of very, very fertile soil that have also higher water holding capacity as well. These were actually burn piles when the site was developed, so we get these spots where it's very, very fertile. This is our low spot here in our field where we have more water, and up here as well as where we have varieties such as Tempranillo and Sauvignon Blanc, which are inherently more vigorous themselves. Right, so again, how fast is fast? Basically, soil temperatures as well are influencing how fast starch is remobilized by the roots up into the shoots, right? So basically, plants that are in a warmer soil, sandier soils, or soils with less water holding capacity, are going to grow faster, right? This is also going to take into account radiation as well. Bare soils are going to get warmer than soils with a cover crop, and hence we're going to have faster growth as well. Vine size is also important in terms of how fast the rapid shoot growth is, right? So your vigor is going to decline basically as your vines get older, and that's because you're going to have bigger trunks and even bigger cordons if you're in a cordon spur system. You're going to have bigger roots, and that's all more biomass that's living, that's still alive, right? And that needs energy to survive. It needs to respire itself, and that will also take part of the share of those stored reserves and energy. Right, so younger vines are going to grow much faster. They don't have all that biomass to support, so more can go up into the leaves, and older vines will have more of that biomass to support. Very, very important as well as rapid shoot growth is what's called apical dominance, right? And that is basically that the shoot tip up here is basically suppressing the prompt buds. Down here, the prompt buds, which are growing our lateral shoots. Right. And basically controlled by the shoot tip, sort of, actually more by the roots, right? So what's happening is that auxin is being produced up here by the shoot tip and new leaves, and it's signaling the roots to slow the production of cytokinin, which is basically going to inhibit our growth of lateral shoots. Right, so when the plant does produce, or when the roots do produce cytokinin, it's basically signaling more growth of the plant, especially from these prompt buds. So the shoot tip is basically suppressing that. Auxin as well, produced in the shoot tips, also is promoting the production of gibberellins, which also is promoting the cell elongation here. So of course, the warmer weather, the faster we're growing, the more auxin we're producing, the longer our internodes are going to be. So the effect of apical dominance, it really has a limit on how far it can push. So basically, once we reach about 18 to 20 leaves, the shoot tip's not really able to send enough concentration of auxin down to the roots to stop that production of cytokinin. So the roots aren't going to receive as concentrated a signal, and they're going to start to produce more cytokinin, and that's going to trigger these prompt buds here at the bottom to grow. Of course, what happens as well on the other side, if we were as well to cut the shoot tip off, which is what we do typically, after flowering, once our canopy is getting too tall, we're starting to have shading of rows. One row is shading the other row in the morning and the winter. Morning and the evening. We have to come in and manage that canopy, and we're going to then cut off that supply of auxin, and then the roots are going to produce more cytokinin, which is going to stimulate lateral growth along the entire length of the shoot. So again, one reason why we are not hedging before flower in that time where we have rapid shoot growth, if we are cutting off our shoot tip, we are really going to get an explosion of laterals. We kind of want to time our hedging in that period where our canopy is declining and our shoot growth is also slowing down. And I say slowing down, I mean almost to a stop. Right? But lateral growth, it can occur earlier than the 18-leaf stage if warmer than average temperatures happen. If we have increased transpiration, that's more or less from warmer temperatures as well, and water availability, also humidity. The drier the air, the more transpiration we will have, and also excess nitrogen as well. Nitrate can stimulate cytokinin production in the roots, and that will kind of override that auxin production, that auxin signal that's telling the plant to produce less. So basically what we can say is more water nutrients, the faster the vegetative parts of the vine will grow. And instead of getting something like this that looks nice with some decent airflow, we will end up with super dense vine, restricting our airflow and being at high risk of disease, reducing our spray coverage, and also shading the buds for the next year. So hedging is the common practice, especially after flowering. I said when shoot growth is slowing down to almost nothing. But there are other ways that are being experimented. One is palissage, which basically involves tucking the shoots down into the canopy or wrapping them along the cane. So trying to keep that apical dominance or that shoot tip intact, and not stimulating excess lateral growth, right? And basically what it's found is that if tucking the shoots into the canopy or kind of wrapping them together, this actually can increase the yield compared to hedging. Wrapping the vine tips also reduce the number of laterals in the fruit zone compared to hedging, and other advantages as well. Both tucking and wrapping shoots decrease the prevalence of botrytis symptoms. That's quite often when we do hedging a bit earlier, we will actually end up with better fruit set and more compact clusters, and this allows clusters to be a bit looser as well. But there needs to be more research in terms of disease pressure. Are we going to build up powdery mildew up here where we have a dense canopy that needs to be further looked at? This is done by quite a few chateaus in Bordeaux. They don't really have a lot of powdery mildew problems with it, but it still needs to be taken further. And the other question is, of course, is it really worthwhile to do this? The cost of labor is quite intense compared to just a machine that can run through and hedge 1 acre in 45 minutes. All right. What else is happening during rapid shoot growth? Well, we do have lots of latent and crown buds in our cane or at the bottom of our spur, and these also are going to become active in spring, especially in higher vigor conditions where we don't have vine balance or we don't have enough buds per plant. The plant itself is going to try to find other outlets for its resources, and it's going to push buds out or push the break of these latent buds that are in the trunk or also in the arms or even at the internodes of the canes as well. So shoot thinning is as well an action that needs to be done to try to control vigor and also to control our overall cropwood and vine balance. And typically we do this when the shoots are 5 to 6 inches long and not more than 10 to 12 inches long. The reason for that is that if we do this before our inflorescence are visible, so less than an inch or less than 4 inches basically, we will get increased vigor of the remaining shoots and we can't get some lateral growth. We will also get as well increased break of other dormant buds, and we don't want that as well. If we do it too late, when they're longer than 10 to 12 inches long, then our shoots start to become lignified at their base. And when we are pulling them off, we're going to basically create an opening or a wound in our woody tissue, and that's going to open up an entrance for wood disease. We as well do not want that. Fruitfulness is something that's very, very important that is also developed during this time of rapid shoot growth. That's basically how many shoots per cluster, how many clusters per shoot are we going to have, right? And this is basically, formed, starting 3 weeks prior to bloom, and up to after around bloom and just after fruit set. A lot of our buds are already set, so we need to have good sunlight exposure, temperatures between 75 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and good water and nutrient supply to get good formation of those compound buds during this time and good fruitfulness for the next year, right? So if we had those conditions just prior to bloom last year, we should be pretty fruitful this year. Unfortunately, here in the valley, last year we had quite a cool, wet spring, so we can also expect that our fruitfulness is going to be lower than optimal, right? To remember that buds that develop in less canopies are also less fruitful, mostly because they don't have this high sunlight exposure, right? So if you have a very, very vigorous or very, very dense canopy, we didn't do our shoot thinning well, or we give a lot of laterals coming out, basically, we're going to shade those buds on the stem and they're going to be next fruitful the next year. Here, just taking a look at the cycle, right? It's a 2-year cycle, basically, to form fruit, and that cycle is, of course, beginning in the spring. So for 2021, that cycle started in 2020, and you can see here the initiation and differentiation is basically happening here in the spring and the summer here. So basically, just around flowering fruits that everything is set, and by veraison, it is basically in dormancy. Okay. So in terms of flowering, shoots are usually initiate flowering around 15 to 17 nodes, right? So we can have a very, very high canopy with very, very wide internodes as well. And so that's in terms of the distance between the internodes, that's not really, or height of the canopy, that's not really going to influence when we're going to flower. It's more going to be how many nodes that we have. This also turns or corresponds to the time where our plant is switching from the reserves in the roots to net production of carbohydrates. So it's becoming basically not anymore a sink, but a source for energy. Right? Our shoot growth typically lags at bloom time. So the plant kind of stops what it's doing and focuses on the flowers, and then after fruit set, it resumes, but at a very, very low rate, and hopefully by veraison it should actually stop. The shoots also begin to mature or lignify, starting at the base, also around bloom, and at this time our buds are becoming dormant, and we are also replenishing our reserves in preparation for next year. And we can see here. This here is the growth of our shoots. Basically, we have the peak growth here, and then here over flowering, we're really starting to decrease, and hopefully by veraison, we are down here to absolutely no growth. Rapid growth as well corresponds to the prompt and lateral buds, right? So if we look here is our lateral bud. This is going to be our shoot for the next year, and inside there are going to be all of your clusters already formed, and you have the prompt bud, which is this here. You can see here where our laterals is growing out. Right? Basically, the compound buds, they lignify, dehydrate into dormancy just after fruit set, but prompt buds can actually break and form laterals. Right? What's going on underground is the other question. All right, so root growth basically is lagging slightly behind shoot growth, as we saw on that previous slide, and basically ceases as well around bloom and fruit set. Right? So during rapid shoot growth, vines are basically allocating around 30-60% of carbohydrates to the roots when they can, and they are also increasing nitrogen availability. And also increasing nitrogen availability decreases root growth, but promotes shoot growth. So that's kind of funny. So the more nitrogen we have in our soil, if we have too many nitrates, we get a lot of shoot growth, but our root growth will actually be suppressed. And we can see here is the seasonal pattern of grapevine root growth. We can see here that basically from bud break, just about 2 weeks after bud break, we really have kind of start to increase rapidly, and then at bloom we have peak root growth. Then around fruit set, again decreasing very, very quickly, and then kind of just remaining or maintaining growth, maintaining the structures that are there up to veraison, and after harvest we are growing again. So basically, which way are carbohydrates moving when the plant during this time basically relates to the sort sink proximity and also their ability to create and export carbohydrates. So mature leaves closest to the tips are going to shunt most of their carbon to the tips, and the leaves closer to the base are going to move their carbon or their sugars down to the fruit and to the permanent structures, right? And the leaves in the middle are kind of split evenly. They all send some carbohydrates or sugars up to the shoot tip and others down to the roots and to the trunk. But they also export all over the vine. So not only in the shoot or the stem, but also down to the roots. Right? Flowers and clusters are primarily allocated carbohydrates from leaves on the same side of the shoot. That is, of course, up to veraison when a lot of the canopy is producing sugars and pumping that sugar down into the berries. And so here's quite a nice picture looking at the movement of carbohydrates or source to sink. So basically, up to just before or during flower development, you can see here, say about 2 or 3 weeks before bloom, we kind of have even distribution, right? So we are basically moving our resources. These leaves are putting it towards upward growth, and these leaves are putting it down and moving it into the rest of the plant. And as we move up here, just before flower opening, flower or fertilization, and then up here berry growth, we're actually increasing the number of leaves that are pushing carbohydrates down into the flowers, berries, roots and shoots and trunk, all those other parts of the plants, and the amount of carbohydrates put into growth of the shoot tip is decreasing up until veraison, when there's very, very little carbohydrates being pushed up into the shoot tip, and then during rapid sugar loading, even that shoot tip is not needed and falls off. Okay. So basically, rapid shoot growth does correspond as well to the secondary growth of roots and wood. Just to summarize, and this also starts to slow down basically midsummer, or basically around our fruit set time, when the daylights start to shorten. Right, so that's kind of a signal to the plant. All right, start to store up your reserves and prepare for the next year. Right, and yeah, when conditions are no longer favorable, the shoot tip dies and falls off. Decreased daylight is a trigger for the cessation of cell division in the shoot tip, so around flowering, and basically our shoot length can be controlled in dry areas by irrigation, basically by controlling our irrigation, controlling the water stress that the plant has. We can control how fast it's growing, and basically that favorability of conditions, right? Of course, when conditions are favorable for a long time, we will have shoot growth going up even past veraison into the sugar loading stage. Something that we did see actually this year, where we did have some shoot growth going on. We even had to do some hedging even in August as well. The presence of fruit also starts to depress vegetative growth of the shoots and the roots. The goal is that the plant is basically producing the same amount of biomass, or it's increasing its biomass by the same rate, but of course is being equally distributed between the shoots and the fruit and the roots. And so if we were to take a look here and add that in terms of physiology here, so you can see we have the compound bud formation actually starting just before dormancy, going through all the way basically till just the middle of fruit set, and then we start to have cessation of growth of the shoots and the roots just after fruit set, and stopping around veraison. Cane maturation happening here around bloom and at the base, and then around veraison, and just a little bit after veraison, becoming finally woody throughout. And here we are, a net consumer of carbohydrates. Here, basically from dormancy up until bloom, and then we become a net producer of carbohydrates afterwards. Interesting thing here, at this time, also just around bloom, we reach peak leaf nitrogen, right? So this is basically when the plant is going to have its most amount of nitrogen, basically coming from its reserves, right? And then up into bloom, we start to deplete our reserves, and our leaf nitrogen is actually going to decrease. And just around fruit, set as well, we're going to reach our peak leaf area as well. Hopefully, if we're in a balanced vine and a favorable condition, right? If of course we have a very vigorous year, lots of water, lots of nutrients, then of course that peak leaf area is going to be shifted more towards the right. And of course, shoot thinning would be our main operational canopy vine balance action we're going to do at this time. Just moving into bloom, right? So this starts, as we talked, between 15 and 17 leaves separated. Starts mid-June here in the Willamette Valley. Caps fall off, and we classify basically bloom as 50% of flowering. So here we have our inflorescence, right? Basically what we call a flower before it blooms. We have bloom here, and then basically we have fruit set and becomes a cluster. So it was only classified as a flower for a very, very short time as well. And warm and dry conditions during that time will actually give us higher percent fruit set than cooler and wetter conditions. And here's just a quick snapshot of how flowering works. You have our caps here, and they will basically the cells will start to die and separate here. And then basically through water pressure here in the stamen, the cap is kind of being blown off, or like it's kind of an explosion is pushed off. And then we have here our stamen, the anthers is the male part, and here we have the stigma, the female part, and this is, of course, being fertilized by itself. We do not need to have any sort of insect or other vector to help. So the optimal conditions for blooms are around 77 degrees Fahrenheit to 86. If you get below 50 or above 95, basically we get absolutely no bloom or no fertilization as well. We have good optimal temperatures. We have fertilization within 12 hours. Around 60 degrees, we have fertilization within 48 hours. But between our flowering and our fertilization, we need to have it done within 72 hours, or our egg will degenerate. So basically, cool conditions will basically slow down that fertilization rate, or how fast that pollen gets down into the embryo, and we can actually end up with poor fruit set. So basically, how long does it take? One cluster can take between 3 and 5 days. Really depends on how warm it is. And one vineyard usually takes between 6 and 14 days to reach that flowering. Any stress at this point can hinder fertilization and hence fruit set of our plant. Water stress, too hot, not enough carbohydrates, not enough nutrients. Strong rainfall can also knock flowers off the vines, and the plant is also very susceptible to powdery mildew and botrytis at this time, and we can even lose the entire crop if we are not on our spray programs. How does it work? How does the grapevine flower? Well, basically it starts here in the middle, and then kind of spreads out here towards the basal, and then towards the apical flowers on top. After fertilization, the embryo begins to form, the walls begin to thicken, and we start to have our little berries here, and then the stigma eventually dry and fall off. So fruit set, generally for us, we would say that 30 to 45% of flowers are fertilized is successful, and below 30% is considered poor, right? That may seem like a really low rate, but we have hundreds of flowers there on our inflorescence. And if all of those were to set, if we were to have 80 or 90% fruit set, our cluster would be so compact that during cell division and then expansion, during maturation of the berries, there would just be no space. And they would all be pressed against each other, and basically they would just, during sugar loading, they would basically just break and leak a lot of juice out all over the cluster, and we get a lot of disease. So for us, poor fruit set is actually a good thing, as long as it's not too poor. All right, what can happen detrimentally during this flowering fruit set period? Something that we also saw last season, 2020 season here. Basically, what you can have hens and chicks, also called mélandrage, over in Europe, and this is basically small seedless berries caused by cold or rainy weather, also by micronutrient deficiencies such as boron. Family phyrates can also contribute to that as well. And basically what's happening is if the flowers are the berries are kind of half pollinating, we end up without a seed, and they don't really end up ripening as well. Shatter, or coulure as it's called in Europe, this is basically unfertilized flowers due to cold weather or very high vigor, which can also be caused by high nitrogen availability. Cold weather, rainy, this will cause quite a lot of shatter, and we basically had situations here in the valley where we saw both of these phenomenons, and unfortunately had reduced yields because of it. So just taking a look here, what else in terms of our grapevine phenology stages, what needs to be done. Here, botrytis can come in, so there as well we need to make sure we're on a spray program, and of course we would do our leaf pulling hedging and crop thinning during this time, as well as part of our biome balance canopy management actions. That's it for me. I know it was quite fast, a lot of material to cover in a very short time, but please feel free to contact me for any questions or comments whatsoever. And thanks a lot. Hope to see you in person sometime soon.